Good afternoon and welcome to Regional Arts Australia's Artlands Conversation Series. My name is Scott Howie and I am the General Manager of RAA. I'm joining you today from the lands of the Wiradjuri Nation, from Uranquinty, a small village in regional New South Wales. On behalf of Regional Arts Australia, we acknowledge the traditional custodians of land and water throughout Australia, and we pay our respects to elders past, present and emerging. I'm so delighted to welcome you all to this session of the Artlands Conversation Series, exploring how art can support us in life and death. The Artlands Conversation Series is a curated program of critical conversations drawing on creative ideas and emerging trends playing out across the nation. And we'd like to recognise that the Artlands Conversation Series is supported by the Australian Government through the Regional Arts Fund. I'll start with a little bit of housekeeping. Today's session is Auslan interpreted and closed captioning is also available. If you need to enlarge the view of the Auslan interpreters, you can pin their video. There's a drop-down menu on their video panel. And thank you to our two Auslan interpreters today, Marnie and Georgia, who will interpret for 15 minutes each and then swap over. So you need to pin each interpreter to maintain the larger screen size. Also, thanks to those who are doing our closed captioning. Down the bottom of the screen, there's also a Q&A button, which you are able to ask questions later in the session as the conversation opens up. As I mentioned, today's topic is exploring how art can support us in life and death, and we are exceptionally honoured today to have the playwright and academic Peta Murray facilitating today's conversation. Death, dying, rituals, rites, grief, loss are regular subjects of inquiry in both Peta's research and her artistic practice. So please join me in welcoming Peta as she introduces our panel and gets the conversation flowing. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Scott, and good afternoon, everybody. I'm speaking to you from Wadawurrung country in regional Victoria. I'm on the south coast, the surf coast, in fact, in the town of Anglesey. And it's my great pleasure to have been invited to facilitate this conversation this afternoon. And I'd like to thank Regional Arts Australia for putting this panel of fascinating artists, practitioners, maverick death walkers and more together for what we hope will be a rich encounter. It's very timely that this conversation is happening at the moment. And so just a little bit of context and some brief introductions before we get down to the business of the session. Many of you will be aware that this week past the Lancet conversation on the value of death was launched out of the UK. If you haven't caught up with this publication, I really urge you to do so because it is an extraordinary synthesis of what is going on in the world, in the space at the moment, and a rather sobering reminder to us that a lost opportunity in the form of the COVID pandemic sees us still somewhat paralyzed, still somewhat stuck in antiquated ways of thinking about and approaching topics related to death and dying. We'll come back to that a little bit later on, but the key idea that comes through in this Lancet provocation is this notion of rebalancing, that it is time for us to rebalance our relationship with death and to get past our delusion that we are in control of and not a part of nature. Now, Scott has already said that we would invite your participation in the conversation a little bit later on, and we're going to ask you to just hold back until everybody in the panel has had a chance to say a few words, and then feel free to launch yourselves into the Q&A and put some questions there that we'll come back to a little bit later on. I'm going to briefly introduce the panelists, but if you want to know much more about them, there are extended bios available on the website. So joining us this afternoon, we have first of all, Zenith Virago, who is the 2021 Byron Bay Citizen of the Year, an elder maverick and death walker who brings a holistic approach and a whole new vocabulary to this whole notion of dying. And I love Zenith's notion of having a death style as well as a lifestyle, and we might pick that up later in the conversation. We also have with us Dr. Julieanne Hilbers, educator, academic, psychologist and researcher in the aged care area, and Julieanne has a long history of community engagement, and she's also the founder of the Southwest Compassionate Communities Network in Western Australia. And that brings us to our two artist participants who are also from the West, and with Julieanne form a little collective, a triumvirate, the Live Die Well collective. And we have representing Bunbury, I was about to say, we have Christopher Young, who's an artist, and we have Helen Seiver, who is also an artist, and they will be sharing aspects of recent projects and their enthusiasm for how the art can support us in life and in death. So on that note, I will ask Christopher to share a little video for us that will focus the conversation this afternoon. Julieanne, it makes me want to pause and observe some silence actually at the end of watching this piece. It's very beautifully put together and has a ceremonial aesthetic in its own way, with the juxtaposition of the silence, the lack of words, the wordlessness, the beautiful imagery, the juxtaposition of moments of solemnity and moments of joy, and the fact that you've chosen not to have a voiceover, but to allow the piece to unfold in a temporal way as it does too. The pace of it is very beautifully considered. Would you like to tell us more about the background to this particular project?
So Chris, Helen and myself have had the wonderful opportunity to come together several times now around supporting conversations around death, dying, grief and loss. And we wanted to have a space where we could create, much what you've said there, Peter, a space that allows some pause, some reflection for ourselves, but our communities to be able to reflect on what death and dying means, and how we experience that, how we share that as communities. And it really came together as a collaborative project of our different skill sets. And it was one of those beautifully organic experiences that just naturally unfolded. We didn't really, it's not scripted, but we allowed it to unfold based on what emerged at the time. And what it enabled, what we found is that creating a space that is held and to a degree safe allows some magic, allows conversations to be had. And the process of art and creativity provided a wonderful way for those conversations to happen and flow naturally, without it being forced. It wasn't like, just tell me what you think. It was through people writing down on the fabric, you know, there something that was meaningful to them. So people brought along, for example, one lady brought along the pajamas that she wore when she was supporting her dad as he was dying at home, and so she was able to tear those pajamas up and write on what that experience and how she feels, her connection with her dad at the moment. And what we found was there was just those beautiful spaces that kept emerging, and there was very much in some ways a ceremonial sacredness that happened. And it was through holding a safe space, and it was through those creative processes that allowed for that. So this communal casket is a weaving together of stories of people across the southwest of Western Australia. And I'd like to acknowledge that I am on Wadandi Noongar country, and that's much of the area that this coming together happened.
I have so many questions, and you've answered some of them already about the design of the piece, because it looks like you set up to, you started with at least a general idea of what you were trying to build. And it looks like the making process led itself, and hopefully Helen and Christopher can elaborate a little bit on the materials. But I guess what I see there is that art itself is the conversation. So even when words fail us, art allows us to have an exchange and to have those really meaningful encounters. And the other thing that really strikes me is the idea of the material and the working with touch, and what touch does to put us in touch, and how touching that is, with all of the possible meanings and riffing on that word. I'd like to invite Zenith Virago to join us now, and to come onto the screen and offer her thoughts on the Remembrance Project, and particularly through the lens, Zenith, if you will, on what you've talked about as a global death care revolution. Where does art sit in that conversation, in that revolution?
Well, I think it has to sit wherever is the most appropriate and at any opportunity, without overriding the emotions of the moment. So for me, because I'm usually working in ceremony, I wouldn't describe myself as an artist at all. So I'm more a creator of the moment. So most of my work is about creating that moment to serve the purpose that it needs to. So it has the rawness of the loss generally at the funeral ceremony. And in there, often people who are arty will write on the coffin, or they will create a picture to put in it. But for a lot of people like me who aren't arty and can only write, then our words, our tears on our tissues, they are our expression of art for that person. And so in every ceremony that I do, I always make a time for people to write down what they're feeling in that moment. So rather like in the beautiful video where that woman's writing, "Love you, Dad," to be able to do that in that moment. So whatever is in you that needs to be expressed is out and goes with that person as a private message or as a private expression. And out of all the things I do, I think that writing of that message in that moment is one of the most beneficial and healing things for people in those ceremonies.
I would push back on your idea that you're not arty. The fact that you use the phrase "creating the moment" seems to me to be almost the definition of art. If art is an experience or art is an encounter, then your capacity to create the space for those moments to occur is artful, if nothing else. So I would push back on that one. But tell us a little bit more about this radical global death care movement. What's going on?
Well, I mean, families always had control of death and dying in their own homes. People didn't venture very far. The Industrial Revolution came along and people started to move to cities. Funeral directors appeared and they were shipping bodies all over the place. And it's become a massive industry. But Indigenous people, like the people where I live on Bundjalung land, always took care of their own. And in many native cultures and First Nations people, they're still doing that. They don't send them off when they get old. They don't send them off to die. They care for them at home. And with that, in the sort of, I think really in the 60s, when people started reclaiming birth, they also started reclaiming death. And, you know, lots of feminists, lots of midwives, lots of people like that who just were thinking, we don't want to give our people over to an industry, to be part of that industrial complex. And of course, I live in Byron, so it's full of hippies, full of feminists and people a bit more in connection to nature because we're living in it so easily here. And it's for the last over 25 years, I've been working in this community, you know, walking with people, accompanying them to look after their own people when they're dying, for those people to die as well as they can, for after body care, which also includes often an arts practice in there while they're at home, keeping the body at home, building your own coffin, creating your own ceremony. But of course you have to be buried or cremated you have to be cremated in a crem, but you can be buried on private land, which is probably the last part of that process where people have keep it at home. And you know, we've really changed the face of death, and I think we opened up a lot of that conversation because our kids, if you change the kids, you change everybody. And so our kids have been going to funerals like that for at least 25 years. So when their friends die or when they think that's a normal funeral with an open coffin, writing on the coffin, which a lot of people think that now because it's become common practice. And but the reason all of that is good is because it creates a healthier bereavement. The more people participate in the dying with the dead body, with the ceremony creation and with the disposal, the more real it becomes and the more they are moving through those emotions on the inside and seeing everything where it fits, and it's not being sent away for 3 days in a fridge and you're just turning up 3 days later with a box. That's really not satisfying.
we have to watch the time, and there are others to bring in on the conversation, but there's so many interesting things. I mean, just the notion of death care and the pairing of those two words is fascinating. And it seems to me that it's not so much a revolution as a reclamation, certainly in your terms anyway. It's about a recuperation of ancient knowledge and other kinds of wisdom, embodied wisdom. I'd like to invite our artists and practitioners to join us now. I can see Helen on the screen there. I can't see you yet, Christopher, but if you'd like to come on, love to fire a couple of questions at you and hear your voices. The first one I just want to pick up on with you, Christopher, and it's, sorry to go here, but Zenith has just talked about midwives and feminists, and I couldn't help but notice in the remembrance clip that there seem to be very few male identified people in the mix. They were not invisible, they were there, but the gender mix seemed to be very much skewed towards female identified individuals. So I'm just curious to get your take on this idea of care and what you think about the kind of gendered nature of death care.
Maybe I could sort of talk a little bit about my personal experience, because that sort of talks exactly to that sort of problem. I mean, Zenith was talking about death literacy in the terms of knowing what you can do. But I, for example, with my father, didn't have the language to talk to him about his death. He got a terminal diagnosis in 2012. And basically in that 6 months, we really couldn't sit down and have a frank conversation. We just didn't have the skills or the bravery, I suppose, to get through that. And he was also quite a masculine type, and I'm very much not. So it was quite a dysfunctional experience. And the one thing I noticed is when he passed away, I also had a completely dysfunctional end of life or funerary experience. And not so much in the industrial sense, but in the personal sense. It tends to distress some people, but I didn't feel anything. And that lack of feeling was extremely distressing. And I had no one to talk to about that, because it's almost like a cultural faux pas to say, well, it doesn't really mean anything to me in some way. And that was the catalyst for basically a big series of photographic work, which was funded by Regional Arts WA, called 8 The Shift. And that's basically how I first met Julieanne, and I've known Helen for a few years as well. And 8 The Shift was looking at exactly that, the end of life experience, the funerary experience, the aged care industry, healthcare in general. And besides the photography that I was doing there, I was interviewing a lot of people and talking to them about their personal experiences, but also their industrial experience. Industry sounds horrible, but you get what I mean. So I was talking to palliative care nurses, doctors, young male doctor down in Albany. I was talking to people who had quite confronting experiences and hadn't really had a chance to talk to it about that. And I discovered through that sort of opening my own chest and sort of exposing what I'm talking about, that other people sort of came into that space with a little bit more comfort. And going back to the masculine thing or the male thing, I've had some very touching experiences in artist talks where, say, a 35-year-old man will come up to me and actually talk to me because he's basically not had that opportunity before. So that's been very rewarding and very interesting. Yeah, I could talk about this for days, and I have for days.
We'll come back to you, I hope. And I'm very interested in how we can invite more men or more other, different genders, or diverse genders into this space, because I think it's a very important, it's as you say in one of your pieces, I think it's common ground. It's the only common ground we all have, really, is this idea. Let's bring Helen in. You've mentioned, Christopher, that you had a particular experience that led to a kind of epiphany. Zenith, I think I would cast your relationship in this work as a kind of vocation. Helen, yours has more been a quest, it seems to me, a quest to reconcile and to understand and to resolve unfinished business. And I'm not inviting you necessarily to go into the extremely personal parts of this, but I would love to hear from you about how art and art making has allowed you to progress that quest that you were on and where you are in relation to it now.
Thank you, Peter. Yes, unlike Chris, my father's death was totally unexpected. And for a very long time, I did not know how to process that. Similarly to Chris, at the funeral, I didn't know how to be either. I had no idea how to handle the unexpected, the tragedy or the violence of my father's death. So for many, many, many years, I was stuck in that place. And then through various circumstances, I managed to find the person who was also involved in my father's death. And now, especially with the aid of my Regional Arts WA Fellowship, I'm able to sit on country with that man and talk about it, talk the truth. We share our grief, and we also share our forgiveness of what happened. And like in the process that we went through with all the community workshops, actually being able to have a safe space to do all that talking and writing about it and creating artworks about it does bring understanding. I now do understand. Hope that answers the question.
That's lovely and perfectly timed, I think, to invite audience members to start to make some contributions in the form of questions or comments using the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. I'm really interested in, and picking up on what you've just said, Helen, I was very struck by what a long and faithful journey this has been for you. You know, you've sort of cleaved to this path and come back to it, gone away and come back and gone away and come back. And in each instance, how I think time is something I'd like us to talk about. Where does time sit in relation to this art making and death and dying? Because I think, you know, as a by way of a comment, is it something to do with the fact that we are now moving so quickly all the time that we are much more efficient in our deaths and our dyings and in our puttings away after our deaths and our dyings? And is it something about art's capacity to slow time, to change time, to rearrange time in order to allow us to engage in the complexities of the experience? Zenith, what are your thoughts about that?
I'm not sure if I'm the right person to answer that question. Actually, I think you probably need to ask one of the artists. But what I would say is that I think for many people, it's whatever gets you there. So sometimes people will be doodling at the kitchen table while we're having an intense chat. So it's part of the process the whole time, and they will create the order of service or the postcard or the bookmark. These are all creations I see of art in that process all the way along. And then, you know, the flowers, the coffin itself, how they arrange the person in the coffin, what they put in with them. You know, you don't have to define it particularly as art. It's just happening intrinsically as part of that process all the time. And of course, then it's gone. You know, all of that is burnt or buried and not seen again. But so for me, it's really about the process of creation, making that moment rather than what's left at the end of it. And I only wish I could archive as well as Christopher, because that is such a beautiful record of a project and a working project that has been of such benefit to so many people who participated in that and the people who continue to watch that video.
Christopher, would you like to comment on the time thing? I noticed in something that you said, you spoke about being the eldest child in your family. Yeah. And I'm interested in, that kind of responsibility and the kind of weight of time on each of us as we get older. Would you like to comment on where time sits in this conversation?
It's a familiar issue for many people, especially those living in Western Australia, that we're geographically isolated from a lot of places. So my family's in New Zealand, so time is a big deal. So getting somewhere, it takes days, weeks, whatever, before I can actually get in place. So in terms of responsibility and sort of caring, it becomes quite a difficult problem. My brother had to go through some pretty traumatic stuff because basically just didn't have the support that he needed at that particular time. I've always found it, one of the things I did when my father got the diagnosis, I sort of went backwards in time a little bit because we'd been almost estranged. Having an interview with him, sitting down with a video camera and interviewing him and asking him questions and creating something together was quite important for both of us, I think. And it also probably gave him a little bit of hope that his legacy sort of continued as well. So it sort of goes forward because he had this big thought that, okay, now I'm going to disappear. And that was probably more traumatic than a lot of his health issues at that stage. And that's been a rewarding document for my niece, who was also very young at that time. So now she can look back and actually get to know someone as an adult later on in life.
Even the choice of the name of the project as Remembrance and your reference to this idea of legacy, I think is a very important part of all of this as well, that art making does leave a husk of an experience. That's the art. The art is kind of the byproduct. It's what's left behind after a process that you've been through. And I think that's what I love about your film so much, is that sense of allowing us to witness that process and to see what is left at the end. We have some questions coming through, and the first of them is for you, Helen. Ariel would like to hear from you about how ritual has impacted your coming to terms with shared trauma.
Very nice question. I guess for me, like Chris, I have to travel to the site some days away from where I live. It's an Aboriginal man that I work with. So we sit on country and we do a lot of ceremony that belongs to his culture. And I feel very privileged to be allowed into that culture to do these particular ceremonies. I find those ceremonies ground both of us. It does make that safe space. It makes a safe space where we can both be ourselves and talk with truth.
Thank you, Helen. This idea, this phrase safe space comes up a lot. It comes up again and again, and I'm trying to think through what that is. And the way I'm hearing it is that it comes down to a lateral shared experience with power, such as it is, evenly distributed and shared amongst the participants, rather than something that is facilitated from above or some kind of, external intervention or offering that allows us to work within that. Would you agree with that? Does it need to have that lateral shared element to work as a ceremonial safe space for you?
Definitely. It definitely needs to be that. We both have to agree to what we're doing. We both have to respect each other's wishes if it's not what we would like to do. And because we're working cross-culturally, that is sometimes an issue. But to know that we are both present, we are both there with full hearts and with hearts of forgiveness, then that's what creates our safe space.
It also strikes me that these situations are invitations to a kind of deep listening. And again, we don't get the chance to do that very much in our time-pressed world. but this slowing down and this opportunity to listen closely to each other, even to what is not being said, I think is a very important part of it. Another question here, and maybe I'll ask Julieanne to come in on this one, from Kobe. How can we help reduce fear and anxiety around being more involved in death care through the arts? So that's a sort of chicken and egg question for you, Julieanne.
Well, I think that the experience that we've had around that is creating very much what Helen is saying there, a space where we can be authentic and genuine and allow also what you're saying. It's not a facilitated space. It's very much, as Zenith talks about, it's allowing an emergence to happen in the moment for what everyone wishes to offer up. And I know for my experience around that mix between art, what we call art or creativity, and ceremony is if we do that well, we can create a space where we can make it easy for people to make that offering. So my experience with my dad was that he lived and died at home, and he stayed there until we took him to the crematorium. And we found that whole experience was very healing for our family, and it enabled us to create what was right for us in the moment. And so much magic and joy occurred through that we actually got to a place that there is nothing else that we could have done. It was perfect. We never would wish him to die, but his that journey that we all had together was as perfect as it could be. And it, for me, was that instigation of supporting that creativity more than art, or that mix of creativity and space and ceremony, but also the invitation. And when I've shared with people about how that was for us as a family, everyone said, but I didn't know you could do that. So to me, I think art offers a permission giving. It provides permission to create that as communities, or it can do if we have people like Zenith and others like to hold space for that. So I think that's a gifting. If we can allow it, we can claim it, reclaim it, as you mentioned before. It is ours. It is our lives. It is our deaths. We have ownership over this. It's about, you know, more and more we have conversations like this, more and more we experiences like remembrance, the more and more we actually start to stand up and truly own that, and can lead and be with it together. Because for me, it's all about the circle. We're in a circle together. It isn't a triangle of someone telling us what to do and we're all passive here. We're in a circle and we do it together. And I feel that that's, for me, if I visualize it, that's the magic of it and the answer to it.
I'll bring Zenith in again on this in a minute, but I just want to also add, in response to Kobe's question about fear and anxiety and the reduction of fear and anxiety, that I think there's possibly a worry in the question itself about which emotions we can have and which ones we can't have. And it seems to me that if we could loosen up a little bit about some of the more what we cast as being uncomfortable emotions, that we can have those things as well in these safe spaces. There is space for fear, there is space for anxiety, there is space for sadness, there is space for the many colours of grief that we can experience, and that a rich human life is able to encompass and have and hold those different kinds of experiences, rather than needing to turn them up or down or banish them altogether. Zenith, what are your thoughts about the fear and anxiety of death and death care through the arts?
Well, I think everything's welcome, because as long as it's real, because sometimes it isn't all nice. Sometimes people don't all love each other. Sometimes the dying person has been cruel or abusive. And that's one of the great things about writing a private message at the ceremony, because you can write, I love you, And you can also write, I'm really glad you're dead. I hate you. Fold it up in a nice little piece, put it in the coffin with that person and smile at everybody. But you walk away feeling that what you needed to express is out. It doesn't stay with you and, you know, eat you away because it didn't get out. But what I would add to what Julieanne said and Helen about the circle, for me, it's also because I am often the celebrant or the teacher, and I am offering what I have up, but the people at the funeral are, so I'm giving that, but as I give that ceremony to them, they are giving me their emotional response in return. And it's more, for me, I'm trying to do it that way. It's like the infinity symbol. So it's like, you know, I'm giving, they're receiving, they're giving that up, I'm receiving their response, and I'm giving them more. So it sort of weaves its way like this between me as the celebrant or anybody and the people who, because I'm doing all the talking, but I'm not affected by the loss. So I'm trying to touch everyone's emotions, whatever they might be, without, you know, trying to funnel them into a grief funnel, because sometimes people are happy that that person is dead. Sometimes they're relieved that that person is dead. Sometimes they don't feel anything. And it's okay to feel whatever you're feeling in that moment, unless it's an issue for you. And then you need to go and get some sort of extra help or go and do an arts practice and get it out. So you don't necessarily have to articulate it. You can draw it out. You can scribble it out, whatever you want to do. You know, everything should be welcome because it's real.
Love it. I couldn't agree more. And while we've got you here, Zenith, I've got another question for you. This one is also from Kobe. And please, other people, if you're sitting there thinking, oh, I wonder, pop a question in the Q&A and I'll feed it through. So Zenith, Kobe's now asking, for those who cannot be at home when they die due to medications and spaces and so on, how might hospital or hospice policy change assist families to reclaim the death care experience?
We have to be the change we want to see. So it's a two-part thing. So it's no good, people do it all the time. They comply. Well, don't. Demand. It's your person, it's your experience. However that dying is, that is going to impact on your response and the rest of your life. So if you want to stay in that bedroom, and being at home isn't always the best place to be. Sometimes being in the hospital, being in a hospice is absolutely the right place, so that the attending people can be family rather than families and carers. So it's not dying at home is always the best answer. But, you know, the system needs to change, but it's only going to change because we demand it, or they see the benefit of behaving differently. And we have seen that in our area, where the hospital system has opened itself up, you know, to families coming in, sleeping in the bedroom with the other people, you know, 24-hour visiting, and people have behaved well because, and the system, it's less, it's easier for the nursing staff if everybody behaves well, because they don't have to keep popping in. There's always someone there and they will call out if something happens. So we all need to work together, but we have to be that change. It's no good saying the hospital needs to change.
It's interesting you say that. My father died 2 years ago, and I felt like I was running an education course for the aged care facility that he was in at the time that he was dying. And I did that by being exactly as you said, very bolshy, very demanding, and kind of insisting that it would be done the way that I and he and my siblings felt was the most natural and comfortable way of dying that we could put together. We've got some more questions coming in, and I'm watching the clock too because we don't have much longer. A question for you, Helen, about your experience and the kinds of artwork you make. I was very, very struck by the beautiful images of you and your co-maker, and the garment work that you had made together. So perhaps you'd like to describe that for the listeners and tell us a little bit about the kinds of things that you're making. And this would be a great point to bring Christopher in too. What do you make to speak about these things?
I guess I start with the materials, and the materials have to speak to me. And sometimes they say, okay, pick me. And I don't know why I need to use that piece of material. I think the material that you're actually talking about is a jacket, and it was a man's suit jacket. And I thought, okay, that's a great way to start. It will bring my father into the conversation, right? So, and I embroidered that jacket. I embroidered it all over. One side is white and blue for my culture, and the other side is yellow, red, and black for his culture. And on the back, where we merge, we become green and grey. We wear that jacket. We've worn it singularly, sitting on the place where it happened. We've worn it together. And quite recently, it occurred to me why we had to wear it together. And this is, again, the materials talking. And it feels to me like that's my father, also forgiving. It's really important to me that the materials are appropriate. And the reason why I thought embroidery was the way to go was it's stitching together, it's mending, it's healing, it's all of the women's processes that I can bring to the project as a woman.
It's always wonderful to engage with materials and to find the eloquence within them, the symbolism and the metaphors within them. But it does seem very clear that this is a material-led process. Christopher, bring us back to the Remembrance Project and the beautiful casket-style beer that you built together with the communities, and tell us a little bit more about the actual crafting of that.
Well, basically, we put together, I think it was 4 or 5 workshops over quite a few number of months, and we got people to come and actually construct it and then add to it. It was quite an interesting experience because I was just thinking about this before about confidence. People are a bit terrified to make a mark. So if you have a whole bunch of people doing simple tasks, they're much more confident. It's the best analogy is probably a choir. They can sing in a choir quite comfortably, but they would never stand on a stage by themselves. And it gives people a space to both share and also have quiet time at the same time. In terms of scale, it's approximately a proper coffin scale. So you have a little bit of distance as well if you want distance. You're not necessarily so cuddly. And all the trees, I think Helen and Julieanne can speak a little bit more about the actual physical materials, but I think they're peppies or something, and I'm not too sure where they were from. So they're very much from our spaces. And then strings were involved, and then the cloth, like Julieanne was mentioning before.
Let's bring you in, Julieanne. At the same time, you might also help us to address a question from Linda, which is about using arts practice and ceremony in the context of family members who are in conflict as they gather during a death process. We have had passing references to this already, that it's not all sweetness and light necessarily at the end of a life. So would you like to take up the conversation from Christopher at this point and tell us a little bit more about your thoughts on that?
It's interesting that in the Remembrance Project in its form, people came to it. It wasn't part of a ceremony after someone died. It was like our collective stories around that. So in that, I think it became a space where people could process maybe some of those things where things had been difficult or hadn't been right or hadn't sat comfortably. Things were left unsaid or hadn't been processed fully. And what we noticed was in that spaces, and that's why you notice the casket has space in between. There were spaces for people to have these side conversations, and in the weaving together, we weave different fabrics, as I said before, that were meaningful. And the art that was created. We created many shrouds, which were from flowers and plants that were significant from place. So in that, I suppose that type of way of coming together provided an opportunity for people to be able to process something that, as Zena said, that hadn't perhaps been processed at the time. But there are opportunities, of course, and I have been involved in things where perhaps art can be part of that, whether it is as simple as a casket that has been built by a community that people draw on or write on, or collectively, where some of those conflicts can be eased to a degree, and not there, because my experience around coming together like that, it can be a time of healing, or it can be a time of trauma. So it can be a time of new trauma if there is conflict, or time of re-traumatizing. So how we do craft this does need to be, as Zenith is saying, the space needs to be held in a mindful and respectful and a considered way, so that all of that can be at play and all that authenticity can be there, and that we can be present with the difficulty, because life is everything, and it's certainly not going to not be in those spaces as well. But I do believe if we do use art practices, and we use, like, even I don't know if you all see, and I'm going to bring you in, Helen, that beautiful image that's sitting behind Helen is a crafting, and it becomes that's Helen's story of her mum and her mum's your relationship with your mum. I think there's, because you're using the materials that were significant in that relationship with you. So if we can do art in a way that allows for that, so it's not just art, it's meaningful in whatever that context is, right?
I'd like to jump in here, because I think sometimes art, the word, is the problem.
Yeah,
it elevates things, and it brings in this kind of sense that you've got to be deeply gifted or trained, or you've got to be sort of struck with the lightning stick of inspiration. When what we see is making. It's a tactile thing. It's a touch-based thing, and that action allows for other things to follow. And if you play with the material will suggest to you what you might want to do with it beyond. We've only got 5 minutes left. We've got a lovely question. Yes, it is a language. There's a whole lot of dialogue going on in the side chat, and I'm more than over my skill set at the moment with the Q&A in front of me as well. There's one more lovely question I'd like to put to anyone who'd like to pick it up. I feel like I get a sense of the care you would have given to your participants and observers of your project. I'm keen to hear what conversations you had about ensuring care for the audience pre and post participation. Julieanne, let's start with you on that.
So I suppose in the sense of when we first started that project, Remembrance in particular, we didn't really know where we were going, and it's already ended up a whole lot further than we ever expected in this conversation that's being had here. But in that, along the way, as we've met people, there's certainly been the invitation for people to connect and reconnect with us or others, and to connect people with others that we think that might be supportive along the way. So I know from my work, having done a lot of things in the death and dying space in terms of connecting as part of, compassionate communities movement, it's able to know who are doing things in different places and spaces, and who might be able to support and work together with. So those I think it's happened organically as along with the process, because it's been a very emergent kind of experience in that sense. It's not that this is a therapeutic one. You come here and then we're going to problematize that and then send you off for counselling if we don't think it's got nothing, which some people could do, and some people do put art and therapy and all of that in that mix. It's allowing for that to emerge, but trusting too in the process that what I think is the magic of is that people have the right conversations they needed to have. So somehow they ended up next to the other person that's weaving away and writing, and they were the right person to have the conversation about that whatever it is that shared experience was. So some of it's about trusting that as well, but also noticing that if people require more support, that is made available.
I need to bring the conversation to a close, but there are two ideas that I'd like to leave with you. One, that these are just two words that are with me at the end of this conversation. One is that we have to move away from a kind of sanitized and pathologized relationship to death, to allow it to be messy, to allow it to be what it is as a discrete and individually specific experience. The other is, and I've found this in my own work, that this is a kind of an emboldened network, and that once somebody has been through and has death walked, has had this experience of accompanying and attending someone to death and the other side, they have now the know-how to do it again and to share that knowledge with other people. And that this is the way that we are going to make social change, is by harnessing this lived experience and sharing it. And the arts is a great way to share that lived experience. I'm going to ask Scott to come back on screen now and to bring things to a close. And thank you, everybody, for this wonderful conversation.
Thank you.
Thank you, everybody. For all those at home, please join me with a little clapping of your hands. Even though they can't see and hear it, let them know what a fantastic discussion. I could listen to this for another hour or so. As someone whose own artistic practice has been described as grieving in public, it's a wonderful, wonderful conversation, and a really important one to keep continuing. So we've run out of time. Thank you so much to all of you for joining us around the country, and thank you very much to the panelists. Wonderful insights. And I invite you all to join us on the 23rd of March for the next conversation series, The Bump In Box, where producer Elizabeth Rogers and playwright Sarah Hope unbox the first iteration of the Bump In Box, a new model for arts touring. So please register online. We look forward to seeing you then. Thank you very much. Go safe.